Affixes in the war within. Affixes continue to be a controversial. So this one seems like the closer that we get to an affix that does nothing, the happier people are. Do you still think that affixes are needed to change week to week combat? If so, what changes would you feel like affixes need to make it? So, this has obviously been a huge topic in the community in recent weeks. It's been a huge topic within the team in recent weeks. We're far from done when it comes to the current state of beta. We're looking to roll out a couple of more pretty significant swings in how we approach affixes in the Mythic Plus system. Testing continues in the coming weeks. I don't want to get ahead of spoiling. Part of what we've been talking about is increasing divergence in the approach that the Mythic Plus audience takes to the content. We look at affixes like bolstering and raging, and for the average Mythic Plus player, to the extent that there is such a thing, is a person who is just running Mythic Plus for loot, for filling out their vault row, and just to have fun running dungeons with friends. If you're running a Mythic 8 or whatever, we're seeing consistent participation and success rates week over week. For that audience, affixes continues to serve a valuable purpose in varying that experience week over week, slightly changing the puzzle that the group needs to solve. Interesting. We've heard feedback from the community that asks, if they're just there to add difficulty, why are they needed? We have health and damage increases to add difficulty, and we agree the primary purpose of affixes is not to add difficulty, it's to add variety. Yeah, I mean, I knew that already. Now, for people who are playing Mythic Plus, the highest end of the system, people who have long since gotten Keystone Hero and all their teleports and are pushing potentially for the season titles or to improve their personal best, the only thing they're playing for in the system is raising that bar, is raising their personal best. And so, at the cutting edge of the limits of any system, when you have variation from week to week, there will be some outcomes that are more favorable than others. For groups that are pushing their limits, if they realize that they are able to achieve a new best on a push week, like bursting or whatever, and the next week cycles in, and even though they could complete dungeons, they know they could not beat their absolute best times this week. It makes the whole week feel that, and it rightly gives the feedback that this is frustrating. This is getting in their way of enjoying the experience. We understand that, and we agree. I don't think the right answer is to remove affixes for all players. However, we are discussing some solutions that may allow players who are focused on the competitive optimization and perfection aspect of the dungeon system to have less randomness and variation in their week-over-week experience. This is something that we've seen across dungeons and other forums over the past. Going back to past expansions, dungeons like Archway or Wakecrest Manor used to have different routes from week to week, or even from run to run in some cases, to vary the experience so it feels like for players running dungeons, you're exploring a dynamic environment. But we understand that if you're in an esports setting or absolutely trying to squeeze every ounce of performance out of the group, variation is unwelcome. See, this is why I don't understand, because I agree that the randomness in dungeons is very annoying in a competitive environment. But then, at the same time, a lot of high-end players say they really liked Wakecrest Manor. So sometimes I don't understand people. Why did people like Wakecrest Manor when it was the most random dungeon ever? And depending on which door you got, you were either fucked or not. Like, I don't know why people actually liked that dungeon. Strange to me. So those are some of our broad philosophical thoughts right now, and we look forward to sharing their plans when working on with the community in the next week or two and continuing the conversation and getting tons of feedback. Yeah, I really don't know what their plan is to add less variation and less randomness. So the less randomness makes sense. Like, the less randomness, I think, could mean, you know, there's no RNG which door opens, no RNG in certain abilities, no RNG in certain affixes, like remove RNG affixes and stuff. But I'm not sure what means less variation. And they don't mean no variation, they say less, right? So it clearly means that they still want to have some variation, just not that much, which, to be fair, I think would be good. Like, the only thing I don't want is no variation. I personally think no variation high and plus is horrible. I definitely want to have variation. I don't think we need as much variation as we have right now, necessarily. As long as the variation that we're getting is balanced between, like, one another, then I think it's totally fine, right? And they clearly are not going to be, like, I very highly doubt that they're removing Tyrannical and Fortified, considering how the score system works, unless they want to completely redo the score system. Because right now, Tyrannical and Fortified are directly tied to the score system, so that would mean they would have to change the score system completely, which is possible. But that would also change it for the lower vault filler group, which I assume they don't want. It kind of seems to me that they want to change affixes from a certain level onwards and not below that. I don't know. Maybe they keep Fortified and Tyrannical and, I don't know, leave the other affixes out. Who knows? If you do a key that is 11 or higher, but then an 11 will be easier than a 10, maybe? Then why would I do a 10? I know this seems all a bit... I do wonder how they approach this. It's interesting. Anyway, with the recent affix changes, the community has reacted to seeing bolstering and sanguine still in the rotation. These affixes seem to go against the mantra of minimizing the mechanical overlap between affix and dungeon trash design. What was the thought process for keeping these? 7+ affixes, and can we expect more changes to these affixes to make them more... Okay, I think Morgan just says here that they kept it because it's not, it doesn't have this randomness, I assume. Again, looking at the data that is informing our decisions, there are meaningful differences in how people experience the content based on the level that they're running it at. Okay, I do also think that, like, at least this is obvious to me. I would assume that it's obvious to them too, that if you're looking at the data, they can see how many people run keys and at what level each week, right? And they will be able to see a drop in participation whenever they have bad affix weeks in high keys. And they presumably have less of a drop in participation in low keys. I hope that they're not assuming that that's because the lower key pushers don't mind the affixes that much. The low key pushers or the low key players, participation doesn't drop as much because their goal is to fill the vaults. So the affixes that are active are not going to be affecting those players that much because their goal is to get the loot from the vault. They might be more miserable one week than the other, but they're still doing it, right? Because they're not going to be enjoying the experience, but they're still doing it to get to their goal, which is the loot, right? I assume that they're aware of that, right? Like, surely they know that people might still enjoy affixes less, but they're still gonna play it. Like, I hope that's not like a purely positive outcome for them when they look at the affixes and be like, oh, well, +8 players are still completing the same amount of dungeons this week than last week, so it must be the same enjoyment level. Like, I hope that's not what they're thinking, right? Right, guys? Anyway, an affix like Stormy that was considered a free affix by very high-end players had a noticeable impact on these success rates in the lower ranges. Something like Bursting, that again is considered far easier than Bolstering or Raging in terms of pushing keys at the high end, has a heavier impact on key success rates than Bolstering or Raging at the lower end because of the strategies that are being used are different. No, it does not have to do with the strategies. What? Why would you think that? No, I disagree. I heavily disagree. I'm pretty sure the #1 reason that Bursting is having a big impact on the success rate on low keys is because the mobs have less health. It's that simple. It's much harder to stop damage, to stop Bursting from rolling when you do a low key and the mobs have lower health pools. I don't think there's any like greater like significance or behind it or some like... It's literally just that, I think. Like, I don't see why it would be anything else. So I think for players at the high end, a lot of what is fun about the system, at least we understand it, is pushing their limits and employing really aggressive strategies to try and fight as many things at the same time and move through the dungeon as quickly as they can. And affixes may feel more punitive to the particular strategies that are most effective at the high level, end up being the most frustrating ones. Players who are playing at a different level, at a different meta, using different approaches to the dungeons, are having a totally different experience. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to navigate as we think through how to evolve maybe plot going forward. Okay, so I mean, I generally agree with their assessment that affixes affect these two groups of players differently. Obviously true, right? So as long as they agree with that, as long as they think this is true, then I guess it's fine. The one issue might just be if they don't understand why, but we'll see what their solution is. In Dragonflight stops, the Saurian Stansma have been used to cancel almost all cast and Mythic Plus dungeons. This has put a significant imbalance on class with and without AoE stops. And players who use and don't use them with the damage intake between a group who uses stops and groups who don't is massive. How do you feel about this, and are there any changes for these in War Within? It's also something we've been talking about a bunch. The role and importance of stops in Mythic Plus is something that has kind of grown organically over the last couple of expansions. The ability to stop casts from completing is something that has always been part of WoW, but generally an enemy that was knocked back or whatever would instantly begin their cast again. You had to use a kick or counter spell to truly put in cooldown, so those were more limited in value in the past. A team had started deciding specific abilities in dungeons to go on cooldown when the spell cast began, no matter what. So if you stopped that cast in any manner, whether it was death gripping the mob or CCing it, it will go on cooldown, and just if that has been interrupted. That is still appropriate in some circumstances, but the increasing proliferation in dungeons is what kind of created this incredibly powerful utility that has been seen to dictate perceived optimal comps in the last couple of years. I think I also disagree that AoE interrupt utility has been dictating optimal comps in the last couple of years. I don't think that is actually true. Look at Season 2. In Season 2, after Augevoker came out, the best comp was Guardian Druid, Holy Paladin, Augevoker, Mage, Shadow Priest. This comp does not have a lot of stops. Like, they really don't. Like, what AoE stops do they have? They have Incap Roar, from the Guardian Druid. They have Dragon's Breath from the Mage. And then they have some Augevoker interrupts, like the Knock Up and the Tail Swipe. They don't have that much as a group. Yeah, I know they have Typhoon Fear, but they don't have a single AoE stun. They have high cooldowns on their interrupts, most of them, because they are ranged, right? So to say that that comp is like a high interrupt comp, like, you guys cannot be real right now. You telling me that that comp has a lot of interrupts? Like, that must be one of the least amount of interrupts a comp can even have. If you look at all the classes that we have in the game. Like, almost any other comp has more interrupts than that, or more AoE stuns, or AoE disrupts. Like, any melee player has probably more AoE disrupts than any of these ranged, really. Like, if you switch to priest with a enhancement shaman, or you switch with a warrior, or you switch with a demon hunter, like, any melee will have more disrupts and more interrupts, except Feral, maybe. So to say that the utility, the AoE, like, disrupt utility has been dictating the comp, like, I think that's just plain wrong. Like, yeah, currently people have recency bias because currently the comp has a lot of AoE disrupts because of Vengeance Demon Hunter, right? But I think that is total recency bias. We've had comps in the past that did not have a lot of disrupts, that were the meta, right? So I think it's wrong to say that the AoE disrupt utility is like the main thing that people are looking for whenever they dictate their meta comp. Like, I think that's really wrong, personally. I think that's one of the last things, I don't want to say last things you look at, but it's certainly not one of the most important things because you almost always manage to get AoE disrupts together in a comp. Like, at first you look for the damage, right? Number one, you want to survive, and number two, you want to have a lot of damage. These are the most two important things. Everything else, you can figure that out. There's no shot you take somebody that has a lot of AoE disrupts, even if they don't do the most damage. That you just don't. Or survivability, of course. Augevoker, in this case, would have a lot of survivability. But to say that you're gonna put together a composition with a lot of AoE disrupts, and you ignore the damage that they do and the survivability you have, that's delusional if you think that. Like, literal delusion. Because otherwise we would have comps with, like, you know, we would constantly have compositions with, let's say, rogues in there for single target disrupts, and like classes have loads of AoE interrupts and stuff, like, but we don't, right? We don't do that. Otherwise, you would have shamans in class all the time. Yeah, I personally think that the most important thing that we look at is damage, survivability, and buffs. And the buffs, by default, you don't even have to mention buffs because buffs are damage and survivability, right? And all of the other things, these are like secondary. Like utility is secondary, interrupts, stuns, like all of this, in my opinion, is secondary. Like, you don't look at that as the first thing. Of course, if the best comp, when it comes to damage, does not have enough interrupts for you to, like, deal with certain things, well, then you're gonna figure out a creative way of figuring it out with less interrupts, or you're gonna replace one guy or something like that. But yeah, if you guys remember in Season 2 when we had this full range comp, people were just figuring out ways where they don't need interrupts by finding spots where the casts just don't go through, for example. Like, if you guys remember in Freehold, the full range team would just sit on a pillar and the tank is downstairs. And then they don't get hit by anything, right? And they didn't also interrupt anything. They just let it go through, and they just, you know, tried to avoid it that way. And they did that with a lot of dungeons, not just in Freehold. They also did it in Brackenheight, No Code Offensive. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that you can do that does not require you to have, like, loads and loads of AoE disrupts. Stops help with survivability, not when the main thing about survivability is one-shots. Like, when I say survivability, I mean bosses killing you, one-shotting you. Because trash almost never one-shots you. Like, if you have a way to deal with it, if it's disruptible, if it's avoidable, then you will avoid it. So when I say survivability, I mean unavoidable damage. I don't mean avoidable damage. Because, of course, disrupts make you survive, but everyone has disrupts. Every class in the game has disrupts. And you can figure out a strategy to play around the disrupts that you have available to yourself. So we've been deciding where within dungeons to move back closer to how things used to be in that regard. Still doing it where it's appropriate, but not defaulting to have all abilities go on cooldown when the cast starts. But why? I don't get it. These tools should still be tremendously powerful tools for disrupting, for managing, for relocating enemies in a dungeon, but they shouldn't be answer to nearly every problem that you're presented in a way that reduces viable comp diversity. Okay, so I 100% disagree with this. Like, I don't think, as I said, as I ranted about for like the last 10 minutes, I fully disagree that the amount of disrupts that you have available to your comp is dictating the meta comp. 100% disagree with that. And in addition, I also think that making disrupts less impactful, I don't think that has any positive impact on comp diversity. None. I don't see how this could be true. No, like I don't know what to say, but I just fully disagree. Like, how's it gonna help with comp diversity? The only thing that this is gonna do is bring more rogues. Like, that's it. It's like, oh, you don't have AoE interrupts? Guess we bring single interrupts again. Because what's the replacement of AoE interrupts? Ian is stating here that it's single interrupts, right? So he basically is saying we're making some mobs not properly disruptible anymore with anything other than an interrupt. And in which way is that gonna give you more comp diversity? If the only thing that it does is make melee more powerful. Because melee have a shorter interrupt, that's it. It just means melee are more viable. Or more needed. Which is what we had in the past. Like, that's really all it says. And rogues in particular. Because rogues have a lot of single target stance in and single target interrupts on top of their normal kick. Let's see what Morgan said. It also just creates disparity between how the game works and how Mythic Plus and dungeons worked in the same cases. Spells only have a cooldown when they are kicked or when they complete their cast. This makes expectation as a player. That's how my character works. As Ian mentioned, taking a step back and essentially re-evaluating, not treating that as a different experience from how the rest of the game works, also provided an opportunity for us to look at this and evaluate other things. We don't want to just make this change in a vacuum. We wanted to look at, alright, these spells that are considered must stop. What's their cast time? What's their recast time? Let's make these changes and look at how dangerous these spells are with more intentionality. Because it's very easy to just have them recasting or have quick cast times when there are interrupts that are being thrown around more commonly. Yeah, no, like I just disagree with this. And I honestly don't understand the issue that they're having here. Like, what are they trying to solve? They're trying to solve the fact that high-end key pushers are like pulling a lot and then AoE disrupting it, chain disrupting it. Like, I understand that is what they're trying to solve, but why? Like, I don't understand why. Like, they're saying it creates a huge disparity between high-end players and low-end players. And that is true. Because, of course, if you do a Paki in a +7 or whatever, you're not going to have a fully coordinated group and you're not going to be using your AoE disrupts in a perfect order, right? You're not going to be doing that. But so what? You don't have to pull the whole dungeon to time a +7 either, right? The reason why key pushers are doing what they're doing is because they need to be really fast in order to time the key, because the mobs have a lot more HP in a high key level compared to a +7, right? So they're forced to pull more to be able to time the key. And how are you able to pull more? Well, by actually coordinating your interrupts properly. In a lower key, you're not forced to pull everything all at once because you have a lot more time. And if you do smaller pulls, you're not forced to coordinate your AoE disrupts perfectly, right? So I don't see why the AoE disrupts have to be solved at all. Like, I don't see the issue. Unless they just want people to play differently in high keys and not use the AoE disrupts in such a manner. But I do think that using your AoE disrupts perfectly, like, it's not mindless, right? I think it requires a lot of skill to coordinate. Now, of course, we have a bad example lately because of Vengeance Demon Hunter, right? Like, Vengeance Demon Hunter has been really broken this season, and it's clearly solo disrupting a big AoE pack, which that is the issue. Like, I think Demon Hunter in particular is the problem here, nothing else. So fix Demon Hunter. Nerfing AoE disrupts as a whole, just because Vengeance Demon Hunter is broken, is such a like weird approach. Because before Vengeance Demon Hunter was meta, we didn't make comps around AoE disrupts, right? Like, as I said earlier, the season 2 comp that was broken, they did not have as many AoE disrupts as we have with the current comp. As I said, like, I disagree with their assessment that the meta comp is being determined by AoE disrupt utility. Like, I just think that is completely wrong. So I don't think there's an issue that need to solve with AoE disrupts. The only thing they need to do is nerf Vengeance Demon Hunter. Like, I don't think you need to address the mob's behavior Because just because you can AoE disrupt pulls doesn't mean that that's easy, right? Especially when they're creating mobs that are immune to disrupts. Like, if you do a dungeon, there's many mobs that are immune to stuns and disrupts. It's not that you just go into a dungeon and you're like, oh, we're gonna pull these 20 mobs and we're just gonna use our AoE disrupt trade and we're gonna move on. Like, did Ian and Morg, like, did the WoW team just watch too much TGP? And they think that that's how everyone plays the game? Or like MDI? Because yeah, it's true that in the MDI, that is how they play. But that's not actually what you do on live keys, right? People don't go in, pull 20 mobs, and then have a AoE disrupt chain, and then they move on. That is literally like an MDI thing. I just do not see the issue here, honestly. This is really bothering me. Might being that guy, but they probably have so many stats and data on what abilities are used when during what key. So, yeah, okay. Just because they have the data doesn't mean that they're assessing it correctly. I mean, I have the data too on what was meta. Like, I remember what kind of comps we were playing in the past, right? And as I said, the comps that we were playing in the past did not have as many disrupts as we have now. So the fact that they're saying that the meta is being determined by the AoE disrupts is literally wrong. Like, it's just wrong. Yeah, I understand that currently Vengeance Demon Hunter is really OP, like, I get that. But you can't just change the mob's behavior in the next expansion just because currently Vengeance Demon Hunter is broken in particular. Like, that's like the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. Like, imagine there's one damage dealer that is like super broken. Let's say, oh, Dasher Warlock is doing double the amount of DPS than everyone else. Well, to solve this issue, we're gonna give the bosses more HP in all aspects of the game. Like, I'm sorry, what? Like, like that just makes no sense. Maybe to see like this. Vengeance Demon made the problem in their eyes very visible, so now they change how it works to never have it again, and allow more new abilities to be made without having to think about every dungeon and its AoE stops. Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. It's just the issue that this is creating the same problem, just like in a different way. We have the data to prove this from the past, right? Because if they make AoE disrupts less important, but the mobs still have things that they need to be interrupting, well, then what do you need instead of AoE disrupts? You need single target interrupts, right? And we have a huge disparity in which specs and classes can do a lot of single target interrupts and which cannot. So it just shifts the problem from one aspect of the utility to the other, unless that is what they really want to do. Like, maybe they literally just saying, hey guys, we want melee players to be meta for the next, like, whole expansion. Like, maybe that is literally what they want. It's possible, because melee hasn't been meta for a while, and maybe they just want them to be stronger again, and then they're like, hey guys, how do we make melee more strong, like, more viable? Well, just make interrupts more important. Because melee obviously have a shorter interrupt than range players, and usually melee players also have a lot more single target stuns and single target disrupts than range players have, right? Almost all melee have some form of, like, you know, single target stun or single target interrupt with a short cooldown and stuff like that, which, if that is what they're doing, like if they're changing the AoE disrupt relevance, then by default you make the single target interrupts and stuns more important, which is literally what what I'm saying is that melee is just going to be more important then, right? This is the problem, right? There's no way everyone wins. I do think that everyone wins if AoE disrupts are important though, right? Like, I think almost every class has an AoE disrupt. Not every class, but like almost all of them. In my opinion, AoE disrupts are a lot more balanced than single target disrupts, right? Or single target interrupts. Like, yeah, there are some classes who don't have a lot of them, and then there's some classes who have way too much, but that is easier to balance than single target interrupts. Which classes have a lot of AoE disrupts? Well, Vengeance Demon Hunter, for example. Well, then address that issue. Address the fact that Vengeance Demon Hunter has too many AoE disrupts. Nerf them in particular, right? And if there's a class that is lacking AoE disrupts, well, then just give them, like, maybe one spell, right? Having one AoE disrupt is fine. Almost every spec has one. And if you're lacking one, well, just give them one, right? Like, that is so much easier to balance than balancing single target interrupts. Because by default, like, what are you gonna do? Give range players an 8-second interrupt, all of them? Because that's what you would have to do to balance it. And I don't think that's viable. All right, so